Part 2. Fuzzy Math. I once read a story about a Latin American country whose politicians were in the habit of promising something for nothing. One party even promised to improve gas mileage by designing all roads to run downhill. Now the joke's on us. There's an obvious similarity between the Bush tax cut of 2001 and the Reagan tax cut 20 years earlier. But the politics were quite different this time around, and much scarier. I'm not an admirer of Reagan, but at least he presented his plan honestly. He didn't deny that he was proposing big tax cuts for the rich, and didn't hide the fact that his tax cuts looked affordable only if you accepted his supply-side economic theories. When Bush proposed a similar plan, however, he misrepresented everything about it. He pretended that it was a tax cut mainly for the middle class, and he claimed that it would fit easily within a responsible budget. It took only a bit of homework to show that both claims were just plain untrue, but for some reason almost nobody in the media was willing to do that homework. In the early months of the 2000 campaign, I had trouble believing what was happening. Was the presidential candidate of a major political party really lying, blatantly, about the content of his own program? Were the media really letting him get away with it? He was, and they were. The result? Bush has pulled the largest bait-and-switch operation in history. First, he described a budget-busting tax cut, which delivered the bulk of its benefits to the very affluent, as a modest plan to return unneeded revenue to ordinary families. Then, when the red ink began flowing in torrents, he wrapped himself and his policies in the flag, blaming deficits on evil terrorists and forces beyond his control. As an economist, I understood what was going on and tried to explain it in my column. Critics called me a Cassandra, and they were right, for though nobody believed Cassandra's prophecies, they did come true. Chapter 5 describes the selling of the Bush tax cut, the tricks, evasions, and outright lies that he used first to sell his campaign on the election trail, then to pass it through Congress. A subtext of that story is the failure of the institutions and individuals who should have protected the public interest. The press failed, disastrously, to explain the issues. Bush was allowed to get away with incredibly blatant lies about the budget. And men who had cast themselves as guardians of fiscal probity threw away their supposed principles. Most notably, Alan Greenspan, high priest of fiscal discipline during the Clinton years, tied himself into intellectual knots to lend support to the thoroughly irresponsible Bush tax cut. It was clear to me that the Bush plan would squander the hard-won budget surplus. What I didn't foresee was just how quickly things would fall apart, with record surpluses transformed in the blink of an eye into record deficits. And of course, I didn't know that September 11th would offer the administration an opportunity to cover its tracks, to blame the torrent of red ink on foreign evildoers. Chapter 6 chronicles the post-September 11th budget debate, as the scale of the budget disaster became apparent and nobody seemed to care. Well, why should we care? Apologists for the Bush administration tell us that by historical standards, the federal government's debt isn't that big relative to the economy. And the current budget deficit, while unprecedented in dollar terms, also isn't that exceptional compared with the size of the economy. But such historical comparisons are deeply misleading. The administration's policies are ruinously irresponsible, setting us up for a huge crisis in the not-too-distant future. Why? Because we are only a few years from B-Day, the day on which the baby boomers start retiring. The U.S. government is best viewed as a big insurance company that also happens to have an army. The giant retirement programs, Social Security and Medicare, already dominate the federal budget. They'll become much more expensive a decade from now. If we have to pay those bills, and also pay interest on a big national debt, something will have to give. So now would be a good time to run surpluses and pay off the federal debt. It's hard to imagine a worse time to be running huge deficits. But why not reform Social Security and Medicare instead? Sounds good. And Bush's plan for Social Security reform played well during the campaign. As Chapter 7 explains, however, that plan was a fraud from the start. When you came down to it, Bush was insisting that 2 minus 1 equals 4. That diverting part of the Social Security system's revenue into private accounts would strengthen the system's finances, when simple arithmetic showed that it would do exactly the reverse. The mendacity in the administration's Medicare plans was subtler, but equally stark. In both cases, the supposed cures for the program's woes would actually make things much, much worse and compound the problems created by irresponsible fiscal policy. Where will it all lead? While putting this part of the book together, I took a good hard look at the nation's fiscal future and switched to a fixed-rate home mortgage. One of these years, and probably sooner than you think, the financial markets will look at the situation and realize that the U.S. government has made inconsistent promises. Promises of benefits to future retirees, repayment to those who buy its debt, and tax rates far below what is necessary to pay for all of it. Something will have to give, and it won't be pretty. In fact, I think the United States is setting itself up for a Latin American-style financial crisis, in which fears that the government will try to resolve its dilemma by inflating away its debt cause interest rates to soar. You heard it here first. Chapter 5. The Bait. Oops, he did it again. October 1st, 2000. It's confession season on the financial news. With many companies admitting that profits won't measure up to market expectations, programs like CNN's Moneyline have become painful to watch. Night after night, executives squirm as interviewers grill them about why earnings fell short of estimates. Needless to say, honest accounting is a given. After all, the interviewers do their homework. They would pounce on any obviously wrong numbers. But I guess some people get special treatment. I really truly wasn't planning to write any more columns about George W. Bush's arithmetic. But his performance on Moneyline last Wednesday was just mind-blowing. I had to download a transcript to convince myself that I had really heard him correctly. It was as if Mr. Bush's aides had prepared him with a memo saying, "You've said some things on the stump that weren't true. Your mission, in the few minutes you have, is to repeat all of those things. Don't speak in generalities. Give specific false numbers. That'll show them." First, Mr. Bush talked about the budget. There's about $4.6 trillion of surplus projected, he declared, which is true, even if the projections are dubious. He then went on to say, "I want some of the money, nearly $1 trillion, to go to projects like prescription drugs for seniors, money to strengthen the military to keep the peace. I've got some views about education around the world. I want to, I've got some money in there for the environment." Nearly $1 trillion? The budget statement, released by the candidate's campaign 3 weeks ago, shows total spending on new projects of $474.6 billion, less than $500 billion. Mr. Bush presumably wants to convey the sense that he's a compassionate guy who really cares about education, the environment, and all that. But that doesn't excuse claiming to spend twice as much on these good things as the number given in his own budget. He continued, "But there's still a quarter unspent, about $1.3 trillion, the size of Mr. Bush's tax cut. I think we ought to send it back to the people who pay the bills. Alas, 4 times 1.3 is 5.2, not 4.6. And anyway, the full budget cost of that tax cut, including interest, is $1.6 trillion, more than a third of the projected surplus." Next came Social Security. Here a bit of explanation is needed. The reason Social Security is in trouble is that the system has a large hole, basically a hidden debt, because previous generations of retirees were paid benefits out of the contributions of younger workers. That hole also means that you can't justify privatizing Social Security, which Mr. Bush advocates, by comparing the rate of return that an individual could get by investing in government bonds and the implied rate of return on his Social Security contributions. That comparison ignores a multi-trillion-dollar debt that somebody has to pay. Mr. Bush, wasting no time, went straight to that bogus comparison. But the safest of all safe, of about 4%, a reference to government bonds, is twice what they get in the Social Security Trust today. Is there any way to explain away Mr. Bush's remarks? 3 major self-serving misstatements in the course of only a couple of minutes? Not that I can see. We're not talking questionable economic analysis here, just facts. What Mr. Bush said to that national television audience simply wasn't true. What is really striking here is the silence of the media, those liberal media conservatives complain about. Moneyline would never let a CEO get away with claiming to spend twice as much on research as the sum announced in the company's own press release. But when Mr. Bush declared that he would spend twice as much on new programs as the sum announced by his own campaign, the interviewer said nothing, and nobody else picked up on it. As I said, I don't want to keep writing about this. But reporters seem to be too busy chasing rats and dogs to look at what the candidates say about their actual policy proposals. So someone has to point out that in an interview intended to showcase his economic program, Mr. Bush did it again. He vastly exaggerated his spending plans, greatly understated the cost of his tax cut, and misrepresented the issues on Social Security. We're not responsible. October 18th, 2000. However this election turns out, future historians are likely to see this as the year that America failed a big political test. After decades of bipartisan irresponsibility, by the 1990s, the United States had, miraculously, started to look like a grown-up nation, a nation able to plan ahead, to take advantage of good times, to prepare for the rainier days to come. But it was an illusion. We were, it turns out, just playing at being grown-up. The basic rule of fiscal responsibility for a national government is pretty much the same as the rule for a family. Pay off your debts and build up financial reserves when things are good, so that you can draw on those reserves later. And these are the best of times for America's government in at least 3 ways. First, we are at peace, with no significant military rivals. You don't have to believe in a new Cold War to think that things are unlikely to stay this easy, that one way or another defense spending will eventually have to rise from its current low. Second, our demography is as good as it's going to be for the foreseeable future. The modern U.S. government is in large part in the business of ensuring the income and medical expenses of older citizens. Starting just 10 years from now, the population eligible for Medicare and Social Security will start rising and rising and rising with no end in sight, and so will the bills. If taxes on the diminishing fraction of our population that isn't retired are to stay tolerable, we'd better start saving now. Finally, right now the U.S. economy, and indirectly the federal budget, benefits from the perception in the rest of the world that America is the place to invest your money. Huge inflows of foreign capital have been keeping U.S. interest rates down and stock prices up, both of which also keep the money flowing into federal coffers. Some economists think that these capital flows, like the similar inflows into Asian nations before 1997, are only setting us up for a future crisis. And I won't say that I'm not worried. But even without a crisis, we know that foreigners, and American investors too, will eventually discover more opportunities outside the United States, that the inflows will someday become outflows, and that we will be sorry if we haven't prepared for that day. So the responsible, sensible thing for the U.S. government to do is to run very big surpluses right now. Indeed, budget analysts who take the long view argue that even without the tax cuts and spending initiatives proposed by the presidential candidates, we would not be running as large a surplus over the next decade as we should, that if anything we should be raising taxes and cutting spending. But how do you explain that long view to the public? The truth is that our leaders never really tried. Instead, even politicians who were trying to be responsible resorted to half-truths. All that business about putting Social Security and Medicare in lockboxes is an attempt to sell fiscal responsibility to the voters without really trying to explain why it is necessary. So maybe we should not be surprised that we have ended up with the worst of all worlds. On one side, the public feels, correctly, that politicians like Al Gore, who use those half-truths to push for half-responsible policies, are talking down to them. On the other side, the public feels, quite wrongly, that politicians like George W. Bush, who tell them that they can have their cake and eat it too, are men of the people. Mr. Bush's willingness to trust in the public's innumeracy continues to boggle the mind. In the second debate, he offered possibly the biggest misrepresentation yet, this time declaring about his tax plan that most of the tax reductions go to people at the bottom end of the economic ladder. That sound you hear is the giggling of millionaires and the guffawing of multimillionaires. But the gleefulness of the crowds who picked up that Orwellian chant of no fuzzy numbers, Orwellian because what it really meant was no clear numbers, we don't want to know, suggests that this country just wasn't ready for the hard thinking that would have let us act responsibly. Maybe better politicians could have made a better case for the right policies. Or maybe the fault is not in our politicians, but in ourselves. Slicing the Salami, February 11th, 2001. The selling of George W. Bush's tax cut relies heavily on salami tactics, slicing away opposition, a bit at a time. To understand how fundamentally misleading that sales pitch is, we must look at the whole salami. Basically, there are 3 federal taxes on individuals. The payroll tax, which is levied at a flat rate of 15.3% of income, up to a maximum of almost $70,000, is the main tax paid by about 4 out of 5 families. The income tax is less than 10% of income for most families, but it rises to around 30% of the income of million-dollar earners. And the inheritance tax, which applies only to estates of more than $675,000, twice that for couples, is a tax on only the very well-off. A mere 2% of estates pay any tax, and most of the tax is paid by a few thousand multi-million-dollar estates each year. Now for the salami tactics. Conservatives who decry the burden of taxes always include the payroll tax in their calculations. And when arguing for tax cuts, the administration starts with numbers that include the whole salami. Again and again we hear about that projected surplus of $5.6 trillion. You shouldn't believe that projection, but for what it's worth, more than half of it, the more credible half, comes from Social Security and Medicare, programs financed by payroll taxes. When it comes to tax cuts, however, Mr. Bush's people ignore the payroll tax. That is, they propose no cut in the tax that is most of what most families pay, while demanding a large cut in the income tax, which falls mainly on the affluent. And they want to eliminate the inheritance tax, which is overwhelmingly a tax on the downright wealthy. By proposing to eliminate a tax that falls entirely on the rich, to cut a tax that falls mainly on the well-off, but to ignore the main tax paid by most people, the administration has made a deliberate decision to tilt tax relief strongly toward the top of the scale. Families earning $50,000 per year would on average get a tax break of around $800 annually. Families earning $1 million plus would get about $50,000. Yes, well-off families currently pay a higher share of their income in taxes, but not that much higher. And no, it's not class warfare to point out that the tax cut disproportionately benefits the very, very affluent. Now, you could try to justify tax cuts tilted toward the top by claiming that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that cutting taxes on the rich will make the economy grow faster. But that is not the case that the administration is making. Perhaps because, given the extraordinary boom of the Clinton years, it's hard to claim that excessive taxes have been a drag on economic growth. Instead, the administration pretends that it is offering broad tax relief for working families. Last week, Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill declared that the plan would focus on helping those people who are close to the low-income and middle-income brackets, adding that it would affect every American that currently pays taxes. This statement isn't technically a lie. Close to need not actually mean in, and affect need not mean that a family's taxes are actually reduced. But one has to say that Mr. O'Neill, whom the press has portrayed as a straight talker, is learning his new trade very quickly. The pretense that this is a populist tax cut is aided by careful slicing of that salami. The Bush people love to point out that families in the lower brackets will see a greater proportional reduction in their income taxes than those in the top bracket. They hope you won't notice that the main burden on such families is not the income tax, but the payroll tax, which will not be cut, and that the children of the wealthy will receive large additional tax relief from the elimination of the inheritance tax. Those staged events with tax families slice the salami even thinner, carefully avoiding any reference to the major beneficiaries. The only high-income taxpayer and the only likely inheritor of a taxable estate ever mentioned at these events is Mr. Bush himself. Otto von Bismarck is supposed to have declared that people will sleep better not knowing how their sausage and politics are made. Mr. Bush no doubt agrees. He hopes that the American people won't look too closely either at the composition of the tax salami or at how he proposes to slice it. Pants on Fire, August 24th, 2001. To Mitch Daniels, Office of Management and Budget. Dear Mitch, I have a suggestion. It's dishonest and irresponsible, but I suspect that doesn't bother you, and it would help you squirm out of a problem that we both know isn't going away. True, your bobbing and weaving have been impressive. Some people have actually bought your line that the surplus has vanished because of congressional big spending, even though the spending numbers have hardly changed since your previous bullish projection. And most reporters, bless their tiny little heads, have written about the budget shortfall as if it were a temporary problem. They haven't looked at Table 3 of your own report, which despite all your cooking of the books, projects only a razor-thin non-Social Security surplus for the next 5 years. But there's more trouble ahead. You bullied the Congressional Budget Office into delaying its own budget projection until next week, so that you could get your numbers out first. Still, when the CBO numbers come out, everyone knows that they will look considerably worse than yours. And of course we both know that the truth is actually even worse than that, because the CBO must pretend to believe what politicians tell it. For example, when you claim that you can provide prescription drug insurance for a third of what anyone else thinks it will cost, or that you won't adjust the alternative minimum tax even when millions of irate voters ask why their tax cut has been snatched away, the CBO duly puts those claims into its numbers. It's a good thing that reporters were too lazy to read last week's report by the International Monetary Fund. I admit 2001 Article 4 consultation isn't a very catchy title, but the contents are hot stuff. Basically, what the IMF said was, liar, liar, pants on fire. When the IMF staff points out the truth, such as the fact that the $1.35 trillion tax cut will actually cost at least $2.5 trillion, it becomes all too obvious that you'll be raiding the Social Security surplus year after year with no end in sight. So here's my suggestion. Declare that the defense budget is actually part of Social Security. The military provides security to society, doesn't it? Then you can say with a straight face that there isn't any Social Security surplus. Including defense spending, the program is actually in deficit. And that will get you off the hook, because you won't have to worry about protecting a surplus that you have declared doesn't exist. My idea is, of course, just an expanded version of your administration's Medicare scam. Medicare's hospital insurance program is run the same way as Social Security. It collects revenue from payroll taxes, and it is accumulating a trust fund to help pay benefits when the baby boomers retire. If you treated the hospital insurance surplus the same way you treat the Social Security surplus, which you should since the two programs work the same way, it would already be obvious that you are paying for the tax cut with money that was supposed to be reserved for future retirees. However, Medicare also runs a supplemental insurance program. This program has always been paid for out of general revenue, just like defense, but your administration insists that it must be lumped in with hospital insurance. That lets you declare that there is no Medicare surplus, and use the hospital insurance surplus to pay for tax cuts. Some people have pointed out that this is a very strange way to make policy. Even aside from the blatantly dishonest accounting, surely a country with an aging population should be putting money aside to pay for future retiree health care. But you've done a good job of shouting those people down. So I don't see why you can't do the same thing when you start billing the costs of missile defense to the Social Security Administration. In the end, we both know, the truth will become apparent. Eventually, there will be no disguising the fact that thanks to the tax cut, the nation has failed to make adequate preparations for the demographic deluge. That money that was supposed to be accumulated to pay retirement benefits has been used instead to provide big tax cuts to the very, very affluent. But then that's been the plan all along, hasn't it? Chapter 6, and the Switch. Hitting the Trifecta, December 7th, 2001. Shortly after September 11th, George W. Bush interrupted his inveighing against evildoers to crack a joke. Mr. Bush had repeatedly promised to run an overall budget surplus at least as large as the Social Security surplus, except in the event of recession, war, or national emergency. "Lucky me," he remarked to Mitch Daniels, his budget director. "I hit the trifecta." Lucky him, indeed. The Enron analogy will soon become a tired cliché, but in this case the parallel is irresistible. Enron management and the administration Enron did so much to put in power applied the same strategy. First, use cooked numbers to justify big giveaways at the top. Then, if things don't work out, let ordinary workers who trusted you pay the price. But Enron executives got caught. Mr. Bush believes that the events of September 11th will let him off the hook. Earlier this year, Mr. Bush used projections of vast budget surpluses to push through a huge 10-year tax cut. Most of that tax cut went to people with incomes of more than $200,000 per year. Now Mr. Daniels tells us that the budget, not just the budget outside Social Security, but the whole enchilada, will be in deficit through 2004. Since the administration's phony budget math, fuzzy just doesn't cut it at this point, gets phonier the further you go into the future, this means that we have effectively returned to a state of permanent deficit. However, with television busy reporting from the caves of Tora Bora, this revelation, which shows that the tax cut was sold on utterly false premises, wasn't even considered headline news. Administration officials insist that the economic slowdown and the war on terror, not the tax cut, are responsible for the red ink. But this is flatly untrue. Anti-terror spending is a minor factor, and the persistence of projected deficits into the indefinite future tells us that it's not caused by the recession either. Anyway, they're missing the point. Opponents of the administration's plan always warned that it was foolish to lock in a giant tax cut on the basis of hypothetical surplus projections. They urged, to no avail, that we wait to see the actual budget results. Now their warnings have proved prophetic, and ordinary Americans will suffer because they were ignored. The administration now says that the tax cut was necessary to fight the current recession. But nobody is questioning the $40 billion in rebates actually paid out so far, and few would complain about another round of temporary tax cuts for the year ahead. It's the huge further tax cuts that will take place after 2002, tax cuts that are now the law of the land, that are the problem. But we're supposed to accept those future cuts as a fait accompli. Hey, Mr. Bush hit the trifecta. Meanwhile, the return of budget deficits has real, nasty consequences. Prescription drug insurance is, of course, dead. Bolstering Social Security? Don't be silly. Payroll tax receipts are being used neither to acquire assets nor to pay down federal debt. Instead, they are subsidizing deficits in the rest of the government. And austerity rules, even in areas you might have thought were of the highest priority. Money to rebuild New York? Sorry, no. The government's own experts say we need $3 billion to guard against bioterrorism? Cut the number in half. Tax cuts are more important. Meanwhile, state and local governments, savaged both by recession and by new security expenses, are firing teachers and slashing services. How about some revenue sharing from the feds? Never mind. Whenever they were asked, voters said that the compassionate parts of Mr. Bush's campaign promises, securing Social Security, providing more money for prescription drugs and education, were more important to them than tax cuts. But they were assured that there was enough money for everything. Those assurances were false, but the tax cut is sacrosanct, while the rest is expendable. Mr. Bush could try to undo some of the damage by canceling future tax cuts for the top income bracket. Instead, he wants to accelerate those cuts. That's the moral equivalent of the big bonuses Enron gave to executives just days before it went bankrupt. Horse racing is a zero-sum game. So, it seems, is budget politics. Mr. Bush hit the trifecta. The great majority of Americans lost, big time. Our Wretched States, January 11th, 2002. Many Americans are surprised at the speed with which assurances that immense federal surpluses were here to stay gave way to the reality of deficits. Some of us, however, aren't surprised. We're simply following a trail blazed in places like Richmond and Austin. In the 1990s, most states had Republican governors, and they applied the same strategy, using what-me-worry forecasts and bogus accounting to justify tax cuts for the affluent, that the Bush administration applied at a national level in 2001. In both cases, the consequences were predictable. The difference is that state governments are generally prohibited by their constitutions from borrowing to cover deficits. Eventually, the federal government, too, must live within its means. But spin and denial can delay the reckoning. State chickens come home to roost a lot faster. In other words, the state of the states is the shape of national things to come. How bad is the state fiscal crisis? The National Governors Association recently reported that its members faced a combined shortfall, that is, a gap between projected revenue and projected spending, of at least $40 billion, and quite possibly $50 billion. The latter number would be almost 10% of states' budgets, a very large number indeed. If 10% doesn't sound that big to you, remember that much state spending, like much federal spending, cannot be cut, especially on short notice. A budget shortfall of 6.5% in the early 1990s led to severe cuts in services and forced 44 states to raise taxes. This one looks considerably worse. How did states get themselves in this fix? The biggest proximate cause of the budget crunch is the end of the great 1990s boom. Second place goes to surging medical costs. Expenses for Homeland Security add a final insult. But stuff happens. Why didn't states prepare for a rainy day? Although they can't borrow in bad times, state governments can accumulate reserves in good times. Instead, however, many governors acted as if the boom would never end. They increased spending, though not all that much. Spending by state and local governments was about the same share of GDP at the end of the 1990s as it was at the beginning. More important, they cut taxes. Now, it's true that state governments raised taxes in the early 1990s, but as new work by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities shows, they didn't cut the same taxes they had previously raised. Increases in regressive taxes, that is, taxes like the sales tax, which bear most heavily on lower and moderate income families, by and large were never reversed. Instead, states cut taxes that bear most heavily on upper income families. The end result was a redistribution of the tax burden, away from the haves toward the have-nots. A family earning, say, $30,000 per year pays considerably more in state taxes than a family with the same constant dollar income did in 1990, while a family earning $600,000 per year pays considerably less. The way for these selective tax cuts was cleared not just with forecasts that made no allowance for contingencies, but with creative accounting worthy of Enron. For example, in 1999, the governor of Texas, yes, him, justified new corporate tax breaks with a budget that not only understated Medicaid costs by $550 million, but hid regular payments for nursing care and other services by moving them from the last month of fiscal 2001 to the first month of 2002. Just last year, with the fiscal picture already darkening, Governor James Gilmore of Virginia, who resigned as head of the Republican National Committee after his party lost the Virginia and New Jersey state houses, evaded a trigger rule that was supposed to postpone tax cuts in the event of a revenue shortfall. He booked an estimate of the entire value of future payments from tobacco companies as current revenue. Now the states must deal with the effects of past chicanery, even as they face recession, soaring healthcare costs, and the fiscal impact of terrorism. The result will be layoffs of teachers and policemen, medical care denied to the poor, delayed repairs to roads and bridges, and eventually, when it can no longer be avoided, tax increases. And why do I think I know whose taxes will go up? It's not a pretty picture, but you should get accustomed to it. As the states go, so goes America. Trueblue Americans, May 7th, 2002. Remember how hard New York's elected representatives had to fight to get $20 billion in aid for the stricken city, aid that had already been promised? Well, recently Congress agreed to give farmers $180 billion in subsidies over the next decade. By the way, the population of New York City is about twice as large as America's total farm population. I've been a stern critic of the Bush administration, But this is one case where Democrats in the Senate were the lead villains. To its credit, the administration initially opposed an increase in farm subsidies, though as in the case of steel protection, it didn't take long before political calculation trumped the administration's alleged principles. But politics aside, maybe the Farm Bill debacle will help us, finally, to free ourselves from a damaging national myth, that the heartland, consisting of the central, relatively rural states, is morally superior to the rest of the country. You've heard the story many times. The denizens of the heartland, we're told, are rugged, self-reliant, committed to family. The inhabitants of the coast are whining yuppies. Indeed, George W. Bush has declared that he visits his stage-set ranch in Crawford to stay in touch with real Americans. And what are those of us who live in New Jersey? Chopped liver? But neither the praise heaped on the heartland nor the denigration of the coasts has any basis in reality. I've done some statistical comparisons using one popular definition of the heartland: the red states that, in an election that pitted both coasts against the middle, voted for Mr. Bush. How do they compare with the blue states that voted for Al Gore? Certainly the heartland has no claim to superiority when it comes to family values. If anything, the red states do a bit worse than the blue states when you look at indicators of individual responsibility and commitment to family. Children in red states are more likely to be born to teenagers or unmarried mothers. In 1999, 33.7% of babies in red states were born out of wedlock, versus 32.5% in blue states. National divorce statistics are spotty, but per capita there were 60% more divorces in Montana than in New Jersey. And the red states have special trouble with the Sixth Commandment. The murder rate was 7.4 per 100,000 inhabitants in the red states, compared with 6.1 in the blue states and 4.1 in New Jersey. But what's really outrageous is the claim that the heartland is self-reliant. That grotesque farm bill, by itself, should put an end to all such assertions. But it only adds to the immense subsidies the heartland already receives from the rest of the country. As a group, red states pay considerably less in taxes than the federal government spends within their borders. Blue states pay considerably more. Overall, Blue America subsidizes red to the tune of $90 billion or so each year. And within the red states, it's the metropolitan areas that pay the taxes, while the rural regions get the subsidies. When you do the numbers for red states without major cities, you find that they look like Montana, which in 1999 received $1.75 in federal spending for every dollar it paid in federal taxes. The numbers for my home state of New Jersey were almost the opposite. Add in the hidden subsidies, like below-cost provision of water for irrigation, nearly free use of federal land for grazing, and so on, and it becomes clear that in economic terms, America's rural heartland is our version of southern Italy, a region whose inhabitants are largely supported by aid from their more productive compatriots. There's no mystery about why the heartland gets such special treatment. It's a result of our electoral system, which gives states with small populations, mainly, though not entirely, red states, disproportionate representation in the Senate, and to a lesser extent in the Electoral College. In fact, half the Senate is elected by just 16% of the population. But while this raw political clout is a fact of life, at least we can demand an end to the hypocrisy. The heartland has no special claim to represent the real America, and the blue states have a right to ask why, at a time when the federal government has plunged back into deficit, when essential domestic programs are under assault, a small minority of heavily subsidized Americans should feel that they are entitled to even more aid. Springtime for Hitler, October 18, 2002. You may recall that George W. Bush promised, among other things, to change the tone in Washington. He made good on that promise. The tone has certainly changed. As far as I know, in the past it wasn't considered appropriate for the occupant of the White House to declare that members of the opposition party weren't interested in the nation's security. And it certainly wasn't usual to compare anyone who wants to tax the rich, or even anyone who estimates the share of last year's tax cut that went to the wealthy, to Adolf Hitler. Okay, maybe we should discount remarks by Senator Phil Gramm. When Mr. Gramm declared that a proposal to impose a one-time capital gains levy on people who renounce U.S. citizenship in order to avoid paying taxes was right out of Nazi Germany, even the ranking Republican on the Senate Finance Committee, Charles Grassley, objected to the comparison. But Mr. Grassley must have thought better of his objection, since just a few weeks later he decided to use the Hitler analogy himself. I am sure voters will get their fill of statistics claiming that the Bush tax cut hands out 40% of its benefits to the top 1% of taxpayers. This is not merely misleading, it is outright false. Some folks must be under the impression that as long as something is repeated often enough, it will become true. That was how Adolf Hitler got to the top. For the record, Robert McIntyre of Citizens for Tax Justice, the original source of that 40% estimate, is no Adolf Hitler. The amazing thing is that Mr. Grassley is sometimes described as a moderate. His remarks are just one more indicator that we have entered an era of extreme partisanship, one that leaves no room for the acknowledgement of politically inconvenient facts. For the claim that Mr. Grassley describes as outright false is in fact almost certainly true. In a rational world, it wouldn't even be a matter for argument. You might imagine that Mr. Grassley has in hand an alternative answer to the question, how much of the tax cut will go to the top 1%, that the administration has at some point produced a number showing that the wealthy aren't getting a big share of the benefits. In fact, however, administration officials have never answered that question. When pressed, they have always insisted on answering some other question. But last year, the Treasury Department did release a table showing, somewhat inadvertently, that more than 25% of the income tax cut will go to people making more than $200,000 per year. This number doesn't include the effects of estate tax repeal. In 1999, only 2% of estates paid any tax, and half of the tax was paid by only 0.16% of estates. The number also probably doesn't take account of the alternative minimum tax, which will snatch away most of the income tax for upper middle class families, but won't affect the rich. Put all this together, and it becomes clear that sure enough, something like 40% of the tax cut, could be a bit less, but probably it's considerably more, will go to 1% of the population. And the administration's systematic evasiveness on the question of who benefits from the tax cut amounts to a plea of nolo contendere. Which brings us back to the new tone in Washington. When Ronald Reagan cut taxes on rich people, he didn't deny that that was what he was doing. You could agree or disagree with the supply-side economic theory he used to justify his actions, but he didn't pretend that he was increasing the progressivity of the tax system. The strategy used to sell the Bush tax cut was simply to deny the facts and to lash out at anyone who tried to point them out. And it's a strategy that, having worked there, is now being applied across the board. Michael Kinsley recently wrote that the Bush campaign for war against Iraq has been insulting to American citizens, not just because it has been dishonest, but because it has been unserious. A lie is insulting, an obvious lie is doubly insulting. All I can say is, now he notices, it's been like that all along on economic policy. You see, some folks must be under the impression that as long as something is repeated often enough, it will become true. That was how George W. Bush got to the top. A Retirement Fable, October 11, 2000. There once was a land where people lived only 2 years. In the first year they worked. In the second year they lived off their personal savings. There came a time when the government decided to help out the elderly. So it instituted a system called Social Security. Every young working individual would pay a tax, which would be used to pay benefits that same year to each older, retired individual. For the first generation of beneficiaries, Social Security was a great deal. They had not been obliged to pay in when young, yet got the benefits anyway. But subsequent generations misunderstood the system. They thought of their required contributions as investments, though they really were tax payments needed to pay benefits to their parents' generation. And they imagined that they could get higher returns investing that money in the market. So eventually an ambitious politician came along, declaring, "It's your money. I trust the people, not the government." He said he would let workers invest half their contributions themselves. When critics tried to point out that this money had already been promised to older citizens, whose own contributions had been used to pay benefits to the previous generation of retirees. They were drowned out by chants of no fuzzy numbers, and so the scheme was put into effect. And the next year, Social Security went broke. Without enough money coming in, retirees could not be paid their promised benefits. I wish I could say that this fable oversimplifies this year's Social Security debate in some important way. But it really is that simple, and George W. Bush's proposal, which calls for putting part of Social Security contributions into individual accounts without any replacement for the diverted funds, really is that irresponsible. Because Americans live more than 2 years, the drama will take longer to play out. Social Security won't go broke for about 30 years, so the victims will be those who are currently middle-aged, not those who are already retired. But the crisis will come much sooner, as the impending disaster becomes obvious. Mr. Bush has made an important political discovery. Really big misstatements, it turns out, cannot be effectively challenged, because voters can't believe that a man who seems so likable would do that sort of thing. In last week's debate, Mr. Bush again declared that he plans to spend a quarter of the surplus on popular new programs, even though his own budget shows that he plans to spend less than half that much. No fuzzy numbers, roared the crowd, but these are his own numbers. And he insists that he has a plan to save Social Security, when his actual proposal, as it stands, would bankrupt the system. But aren't there good economists, even experts on Social Security, who support Mr. Bush's proposal? Think of it as a Faustian bargain, selling their souls not for power or wealth, maybe that too, but that's not my department, but for reform. For there is a good case for Social Security reform if we are prepared to pay the price. The current system, in effect, promises today's workers that future generations will take care of them, just as they are taking care of today's retirees. As a Bush advisor, Martin Feldstein, has pointed out, this makes people feel richer than they really are, leading them to consume too much and save too little. But to fix this problem would take a lot of money to pay off the system's existing obligations. Or to put it differently, making the same point from a different angle, since the problem with Social Security is that it makes people feel artificially rich, any real reform has to make them feel poorer. But that, of course, is not what Mr. Bush is selling. What economists who support his proposal presumably believe is that after the election, this can all be fixed. When the real plan is announced, it will actually make sense. But it's hard to see how. Try to imagine a victorious Mr. Bush explaining that he has to slash benefits after all, or abandoning his tax cut so that he has enough money to pay for Social Security reform. What is certain is that Mr. Bush's actual Social Security proposal would bankrupt the system. That's not a fuzzy number. It's a cold, hard fact. 2016 and all that. July 22nd, 2001. I knew that the Commission on Social Security Reform, appointed by George W. Bush, would produce a slanted report, one designed to bully Congress into privatizing the system. But the draft report released last week is sheer, mean-spirited nonsense. The Commission, in an attempt to sow panic, claims that Social Security is in imminent peril, that the system will be in crisis as soon as 2016. That's wildly at odds with the standard projection, which says that Social Security reserves will last until 2038. And even that projection is based on quite pessimistic assumptions about future economic growth, and hence, future payroll tax receipts. If you use more optimistic assumptions, say the assumptions in the budget forecasts that were used to justify Mr. Bush's tax cut, the system will still be financially sound in 2075. So how did the Commission reach its pessimistic conclusion? Through a truly Orwellian exercise in doublethink, the art of believing two mutually contradictory things at the same time. It's true that in 2016, according to pessimistic projections, benefit payments will start to exceed payroll tax receipts. By then, however, the Social Security system will have accumulated a multi-trillion-dollar trust fund. Just as a private pension fund uses earnings on its assets to pay benefits, the Social Security system can use earnings from this trust fund to pay benefits. And that trust fund will extend the life of the system for decades, perhaps indefinitely. But the Commission declares that these accumulated assets aren't real, and don't count as resources available to pay future benefits. Why? Because they're invested in government bonds, perfectly good assets when they are accumulated by private pension funds, but worthless, says the Commission, when accumulated by a government agency. Does this make any sense? There is a school of thought that says that Social Security shouldn't have a separate budget, that Social Security receipts should be regarded simply as part of general revenue, and outlays as part of general expenditure. But in that case, it's hard to see why we should get worked up about 2016. Who cares if the payroll tax, which is only one of many taxes, collects less money than the government spends on retirement benefits, which are only one of many government expenses? Social Security benefits can be paid out of the general budget, a transfer of revenue that is clearly justified if payroll tax receipts have meanwhile been used to pay off the national debt, releasing large sums that would otherwise have been consumed by interest payments. Alternatively, you could say that for political reasons, it's important that Social Security have its own separate account. But in that case, we should count government bonds in the trust fund as real assets, just as we would if Social Security were a private pension fund. Here's a proposal. Let's launder the trust fund by putting it in private banks, which then buy government bonds. Will that make the assets real? So the Commission is trying to have it both ways. When Social Security runs surpluses, it doesn't get any credit because it's just part of the government. But when it runs deficits, Social Security is on its own. This twisted logic, in effect, expropriates all of the extra money workers have paid into the system since 1983, when Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, among others, pushed through an increase in payroll taxes, an increase whose purpose was to build up the trust fund that the Commission, co-chaired by Mr. Moynihan, now says isn't real. And how big will the Social Security deficit be once the trust fund has been expropriated? The Commission says 37% of payroll tax receipts, which sounds immense, but that's only about 2% of GDP. That's an interesting number. It's about what the federal government now pays in interest on its debt, the debt that Social Security surpluses are being used to pay off. Oh, and there's another budget item that's about the same size as the putative Social Security shortfall, the Bush tax cut, which will eventually reduce revenue by about 1.7% of GDP. There is a case for reforming Social Security. There is even a case for privatization. But we can't have a meaningful debate about reform unless the parties to the debate are willing to discuss the issues honestly. And the members of the Commission, including Mr. Moynihan, have just disqualified themselves. Bad Medicine, March 19th, 2002. Sunday's front-page story in the Times on doctors who shun patients with Medicare may have been alarming enough. It seems that recent cuts in Medicare payments are inducing many doctors to avoid treating Medicare recipients at all. But this is just the beginning of a struggle that will soon dominate American politics. Think of it as the collision between an irresistible force, the growing cost of healthcare, and an immovable object, the determination of America's conservative movement to downsize government. For the moment, the Bush administration and its allies still won't admit that there is any conflict between their promises to retirees and their small government ideology. But we're already past the stage where this conflict can be hidden with fudged numbers. The effort to live within unrealistically low targets for Medicare expenses has already translated into unrealistically low payments to healthcare providers, and it gets worse from here. Why do healthcare costs keep on rising? It's not because doctors and hospitals are greedy. It's because of medical progress. More and more conditions that once lay beyond doctors' reach can now be treated, adding years to the lives of patients and greatly increasing the quality of those years, but at ever greater expense. A triple coronary bypass does a lot more for you than a nice bedside manner, but it costs a lot more too. During the 1990s, the upward trend in healthcare costs seemed to level off. But it's now clear that this was a one-time cost squeeze due to the shift to HMOs. Now medical costs have resumed their upward march. If medicine were purely a private matter, medical progress would pose no more of a dilemma than, say, progress in home entertainment systems. But in fact, the United States, like every advanced country, treats essential health care as a right, not a privilege. Our Medicare-Medicaid combination provides this right somewhat haphazardly Still, the intent of our system is that nobody should be denied life-saving treatment for lack of funds. Why don't we just leave medical care up to individuals? Basically, even in the United States, there are limits to how much inequality the public is prepared to tolerate. It's one thing if the rich can afford bigger houses or fancier vacations than ordinary families. Americans accept such differences cheerfully. But a society in which rich people get their medical problems solved, while ordinary people die from them, is too harsh even for us. And so we have Medicare and Medicaid. And the public overwhelmingly supports the extension of Medicare to include prescription drugs for the same reason. It seems wrong to most Americans that drugs that make a big difference to people's lives should be available only to those wealthy enough to pay for those drugs out of pocket. Including drug coverage in Medicare is not so much a matter of extending the program as of remaining true to its original intent. But meeting the public's expectations for medical care, that is, ensuring that every American, and in particular every retired American, gets essential care, will require a lot of government spending. And the conservative movement in general, and the Bush administration in particular, are not prepared to make the money available. After all, government spending must ultimately be paid for with taxes. Yet they dare not say openly that they are prepared to deny essential health care to those who cannot afford it. So what can they do? The Bush administration is still trying to fake it. The budget proposal it released last month had healthcare economists rubbing their eyes. It assumed a far lower rate of growth in Medicare expenses than anyone else thinks plausible. Overall, it budgeted $300 billion less over the next decade than the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office projects will be needed. And it also repeated the implausible claim that we can have prescription drug insurance on the cheap, setting aside half or less what others think such a program will cost. But we have already reached the point at which we must either come up with more money or deny health care to retirees. The moral of Sunday's story is that Medicare payments have already been squeezed beyond their limits, to the point where recipients can't find doctors willing to take them. Something will have to give, and soon. Part 3. Victors and Spoils. How did we get here? How did the American political system, which produced such reasonable economic leadership during the 1990s, lead us into our current morass of dishonesty and irresponsibility? This is not a question I ever expected to be answering. I still don't regard myself primarily as a political columnist. In fact, as I explained in the preface to this audiobook, I originally expected my New York Times column to be mainly focused on business and international economics, not domestic politics. But as the wreckage accumulates, I found it necessary to try to explain just why our policies are so bad. A partial answer, I believe, is that American politics has become highly polarized. The center did not hold. Underlying that political polarization is the growing inequality of income. The result is a form of class warfare, driven not by attempts of the poor to soak the rich, but by the efforts of an economic elite to expand its privileges. Chapter 8 looks at the polarization of American politics along economic lines, paralleling the polarization of the income distribution. It also describes how ideas that would have been beyond the pale not long ago, inherited privilege is good, poor people don't pay enough taxes, have been edging their way into political discourse. The crusade against the welfare state rests on an ideology that denigrates almost everything other than national defense that the government does. Today's conservatives want to dislodge the government even from traditional roles like environmental protection, securities regulation, and air traffic control. Some, including the Times editorial page, thought that the terrorist attack on September 11th, which bore no resemblance to conventional military conflict, might change that attitude. But no, as Chapter 9 documents, the Bush administration and its congressional allies were unmoved. For example, only days after September 11th, they still tried to prevent a public takeover of airline security. And after a few days of effusive sympathy for New York and photo ops with firemen, promises of aid began to be broken. In February 2003, the logic of privatization reached the point of absurdity. Having done almost nothing to strengthen homeland security, the administration urged the public to protect itself with duct tape and plastic sheeting. It's understandable why many people expected the Bush administration to scale back its domestic agenda after September 11th. After all, the administration said it was war, and tradition says that war is not a time to pursue policies that divide the nation. Most famously, after Pearl Harbor, FDR declared that Dr. New Deal had to be replaced with Dr. Win the War. He put his political agenda on hold in the interest of national unity. After September 11th, however, the Bush administration did the opposite. It treated terrorism as a partisan political opportunity. Few things I have written have generated as much hate mail as the columns in which I accused the administration of exploiting September 11th for political gain, of wrapping itself in the flag while it sought weakened environmental regulation, tax cuts for corporations and the rich, and above all, an upper hand in the midterm election. But as Chapter 10 explains, exploitation began within hours after the attack, and gradually it became apparent, not just to me, but to a growing number of other observers, that we had some very unscrupulous people running the country. Every administration contains its share of cynical political operators. Without them, even the best man has no chance of achieving high office. But this administration seems to have nothing but cynical political operators, who use national tragedy for political gain, don't even try to come to grips with real problems, and figure that someone else will clean up the mess they leave behind. So how did we end up being ruled by these people? Chapter 11 is a look at the dirty, not-so-secret secret of recent American politics, the increasing manipulation of the media and the political process by lavishly funded right-wing groups. Yes, Virginia, there is a vast right-wing conspiracy. It's not even especially hidden. Anyone with a modem and some spare time can inform himself about the network of institutions that systematically harass prominent liberals and bully news sources that don't toe the line. I have, of course, been a target myself. But it isn't often discussed in major newspapers. Here you can hear about it. Chapter 8. Things Pull Apart. America the Polarized, January 4th, 2002. When Congress returns to Washington, the battles will resume, and each party will accuse the other of partisanship. Why can't they just get along? Because fundamental issues are at stake, and the parties are as far apart on those issues as they have ever been. A recent article in Slate led me to Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal, political scientists who use data on congressional voting to create maps of politicians' ideological positions. They find that a representative's votes can be predicted quite accurately by his position in two dimensions, one corresponding to race issues, the other a left versus right economic scale reflecting issues such as marginal tax rates and the generosity of benefits to the poor. And they also find, not too surprisingly, that the center did not hold. Ralph Nader may sneer at Republicrats, but Democrats and Republicans have diverged sharply since the 1980s, and are now further apart on economic issues than they have been since the early 20th century. Whose position changed? Tom Daschle doesn't seem markedly more liberal than, say, the late Tip O'Neill. On the other hand, Tom DeLay, who will soon be House Majority Leader, is clearly to the right of previous Republican leaders. In short, casual observation suggests that American politics has become polarized because Republicans have shifted to the right and Democrats haven't followed them. And sure enough, the Poole-Rosenthal numbers that show a divergence between the parties also show that this divergence reflects a Republican move towards more conservative economic policies, while Democrats have more or less stayed put. As people like James Jeffords and Lincoln Chafee have found, it has become very hard to be what we used to call a moderate Republican. But why did the Republicans move to the right? It could be a matter of sheer intellectual conviction. Republicans have realized that low taxes and small government are good for everyone, and Democrats just don't get it. But ideas tend to take root when the soil has been fertilized by social and economic trends. Dr. Poole suggests that the most likely source of political polarization is economic polarization, the sharply widening inequality of income and wealth. I know from experience that even mentioning income distribution leads to angry accusations of class warfare. But anyway, here's what the truly nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office recently found. Adjusting for inflation, the income of families in the middle of the U.S. income distribution rose from $41,400 in 1979 to $45,100 in 1997, a 9% increase. Meanwhile, the income of families in the top 1% rose from $420,200 to $1.016 million, a 140% increase. Or to put it another way, the income of families in the top 1% was 10 times that of typical families in 1979 and 23 times and rising in 1997. It would be surprising indeed if this tectonic shift in the economic landscape weren't reflected in politics. You might have expected the concentration of income at the top to provoke populist demands to soak the rich. But as I said, both casual observation and the Poole-Rosenthal numbers tell us that the Democrats haven't moved left, the Republicans have moved right. Indeed, the Republicans have moved so far to the right that ordinary voters have trouble taking it in. As I pointed out in an earlier column, focus groups literally refuse to believe accurate descriptions of the stimulus bill that House Republican leaders passed on a party-line vote back in October. Why has the response to rising inequality been a drive to reduce taxes on the rich? Good question. It's not a simple matter of rich people voting themselves a better deal. There just aren't enough of them. To understand political trends in the United States, we probably need to think about campaign finance, lobbying, and the general power of money to shape political debate. In any case, the moral of this story is that the political struggles in Washington right now are not petty squabbles. The right is on the offensive. The left, occupying the position formerly known as the center, wants to hold the line. Many commentators still delude themselves with the comforting notion that all this partisanship is a temporary aberration. Sorry, guys, this is the way it's going to be for the foreseeable future. Get used to it. The Suns Also Rise, November 22, 2002. America, we all know, is the land of opportunity. Your success in life depends on your ability and drive, not on who your father was. Just ask the Bush brothers. Talk to Elizabeth Cheney, who holds a specially created State Department job, or her husband, Chief Counsel of the Office of Management and Budget. Interview Eugene Scalia, the top lawyer at the Labor Department, and Janet Rehnquist, Inspector General at the Department of Health and Human Services. And don't forget to check in with William Kristol, editor of the Weekly Standard, and the conservative commentator John Podhoretz. What's interesting is how little comment, let alone criticism, this roll call has occasioned. It might be just another case of kid gloves treatment by the media, but I think it's a symptom of a broader phenomenon. Inherited status is making a comeback. It has always been good to have a rich or powerful father. Last week, my Princeton colleague Alan Kruger wrote a column for The Times surveying statistical studies that debunk the mythology of American social mobility. If the United States stands out in comparison with other countries, he wrote, it is in having a more static distribution of income across generations with fewer opportunities for advancement. And Kevin Phillips, in his book Wealth and Democracy, shows that robber baron fortunes have been far more persistent than legend would have it. But the past is only prologue. According to one study cited by Mr. Kruger, the heritability of status has been increasing in recent decades. And that's just the beginning. Underlying economic, social, and political trends will give the children of today's wealthy a huge advantage over those who chose the wrong parents. For one thing, there's more privilege to pass on. 30 years ago, the CEO of a major company was a bureaucrat, well paid but not truly wealthy. He couldn't give either his position or a large fortune to his heirs. Today's imperial CEOs, by contrast, will leave vast estates behind, and they are often able to give their children lucrative jobs, too. More broadly, the spectacular increase in American inequality has made the gap between the rich and the middle class wider and hence more difficult to cross than it was in the past. Meanwhile, one key doorway to upward mobility, a good education system available to all, has been closing. More and more, ambitious parents feel that a public school education is a dead end. It's telling that Jack Grubman, the former Salomon Smith Barney analyst, apparently sold his soul not for personal wealth, but for 2 places in the right nursery school. Alas, most American souls aren't worth enough to get the kids into the 92nd Street Y. Also, the heritability of status will be mightily reinforced by the repeal of the estate tax, a prime example of the odd way in which public policy and public opinion have shifted in favor of measures that benefit the wealthy even as our society becomes increasingly class-ridden. It wasn't always thus. The influential dynasties of the 20th century, like the Kennedys, the Rockefellers, and, yes, the Sulzbergers, faced a public suspicious of inherited position. They overcame that suspicion by demonstrating a strong sense of noblesse oblige, justifying their existence by standing for high principles. Indeed, the Kennedy legend has a whiff of Bonnie Prince Charlie about it. The rightful heirs were also perceived as defenders of the downtrodden against the powerful. But today's heirs feel no need to demonstrate concern for those less fortunate. On the contrary, they are often avid defenders of the powerful against the downtrodden. Mr. Scalia's principal personal claim to fame is his crusade against regulations that protect workers from ergonomic hazards, while Ms. Rehnquist has attracted controversy because of her efforts to weaken the punishment of healthcare companies found to have committed fraud. The official ideology of America's elite remains one of meritocracy, just as our political leadership pretends to be populist. But that won't last. Soon enough, our society will rediscover the importance of good breeding and the vulgarity of talented upstarts. For years, opinion leaders have told us that it's all about family values. And it is, but it will take a while before most people realize that they meant the value of coming from the right family. Hey Lucky Duckies, December 3rd, 2002. Carping critics of the conservative movement have been known to say that its economic program consists of little more than tax cuts, and more tax cuts. I may even have said that myself. If so, I apologize. Emboldened by the midterm election, key conservative ideologues have now declared their support for tax increases, but only for people with low incomes. The public debut of this idea came, as such things often do, on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. The page's editors, it seems, are upset that some low-income people pay little or nothing in income taxes. Not, mind you, because of the lost revenue, but because these lucky duckies, the Journal's term, not mine, might not be feeling a proper hatred for the government. The Journal considers a hypothetical ducky who earns only $12,000 a year, some guys have all the luck, and therefore, according to the editorial, pays a little less than 4% of income in taxes. Not surprisingly, that statement is a deliberate misrepresentation. The calculation refers only to income taxes. If you include payroll and sales taxes, a worker earning $12,000 probably pays well over 20% of income in taxes. But who's counting? What's interesting, however, is what the Journal finds wrong with this picture. The worker's taxes aren't enough to get his or her blood boiling with rage. In case you're wondering what this is about, it's an internal squabble of the right. The Journal is terrified that future tax cuts might include token concessions to ordinary families. It wants to ensure that everything goes to corporations and the wealthy. But the political theory revealed by the editorial, policy should be nasty to people with low incomes, lest they have any good feelings about government, may explain a lot of what has been happening lately. For example, House Republicans recently refused to extend unemployment insurance. Their inaction means that later this month, more than 800,000 workers will receive Merry Christmas letters from the government, telling them that their benefits have been cut off. This would have been a harsh decision under any circumstances. At a time when the administration says we need further tax cuts to stimulate demand, slashing the incomes of the very households most likely to cut their spending sounds like a lose-lose proposition. But once you realize that pain is good because it makes citizens hate their government, it all makes sense. An even better example is the failure of Congress to provide adequate funds for the state children's health insurance program. The details of the legislative maneuvering are complex, but what it comes down to is that conservatives showed no interest in maintaining adequate funding for this highly successful program. The sums involved are not large by Washington standards, but the result will be dramatic. According to Office of Management and Budget estimates, 900,000 children will lose health insurance over the next 3 years. We are, of course, now living in what George W. Bush has called the era of personal responsibility. If a child chooses to have parents who can't afford health care, that child will have to accept the consequences. But there may also be political calculation involved. Again, the government mustn't do anything good, because then people might not realize that government is bad. Understand? What do we learn from this catalog of cruelties? We learned that compassionate conservatism and leave no child behind were empty slogans. But while this may have come as a surprise to the faith-based John J. DiIulio, some of us thought it was obvious all along. More important, we learn how relentless and extremist today's conservative movement really is. Some people, moderate Republicans who aren't ready to admit what has happened to their party, and Democrats who think their party can appease the right by making its own promises of smaller government, still don't get it. They imagine that at some point the right will decide that it has gotten what it wants. But the right's ambitions have no limits, and nothing moderates can offer will appease it. Eventually, the public, which actually benefits from most of the programs the right is determined to abolish, will figure that out. But how fast voters figure it out depends a lot on whether moderate politicians clearly articulate the issues or try to escape detection by sounding like conservatives.